You hear the screaming before you see anything else. A woman's voice, raw and animal, tearing through the suffocating heat of a Spanish summer morning. The stone walls around you seem to sweat. Incense chokes the air, mixing with something metallic, something wrong. You stand frozen outside massive oak doors, listening to sounds that don't belong to childbirth alone. They carry the weight of something darker, something that has been building for generations. Behind those doors, a queen is about to deliver not just an heir to the Spanish throne, but the living consequence of nearly 200 years of calculated genetic catastrophe. And though no one in that palace can name what's happening in scientific terms, everyone knows in their bones, in their whispered prayers, that what emerges from that room will change everything. Before we go deeper into this nightmare, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. It absolutely fascinates me that we're connecting across continents over a story this dark, this human, this impossible to forget. The date is November 6th, 1665. The place is the Alcazar of Madrid, the heart of what was once the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. The woman screaming is Queen Mariana of Austria, and the child fighting to enter this world will be known to history as Charles II of Spain el Hechizado, the Bewitched. But to understand the true horror of his birth, we must first understand that this moment didn't happen by accident. It was engineered, orchestrated across generations by a family that believed their blood was too precious to share with commoners, too divine to dilute with outsiders. The Habsburgs didn't stumble into genetic disaster. They pursued it with the methodical precision of architects building a cathedral. Except what they built wasn't a monument to God. It was a monument to hubris. And Charles II would be its final, broken cornerstone. The Habsburg dynasty had risen to dominance through a deceptively simple strategy. Marry within the family, keep the power concentrated, never let the bloodline escape your control. Their family motto said it all, Bella gerant Ali, to Felix Austria nube. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. And marry they did. Cousins to cousins. Uncles to nieces. Over and over, generation after generation, until their family tree stopped looking like a tree at all. It became a knot, a genetic noose that tightened with every wedding ceremony. It started almost innocently in the 1400s with Emperor Maximilian III, who understood that strategic marriages could accomplish what armies could not. His descendants took that lesson and twisted it into something far more dangerous. By the time Charles V inherited the throne in 1519, the Habsburg Empire stretched across Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, Naples, and vast territories in the New World. The sun never set on Habsburg lands, but even as their political power reached its zenith, the genetic foundation was already cracking beneath them. Charles V himself was born from first cousins. His jaw protruded slightly, a minor deformity that would become the family's signature curse. When Charles V abdicated in 1556, he split his empire between his son, Philip II, who took Spain, and his brother Ferdinand, who took Austria. This division created two parallel Habsburg lines that would spend the next century systematically intermarrying, amplifying their genetic load with each union. Philip II became the true architect of the family's doom. He married 4 times, and 3 of those marriages were to close blood relatives. His final marriage set the template for catastrophe. At 43 years old, he married his 20-year-old niece, Anna of Austria. She wasn't just his niece, she was also his first cousin, once removed through multiple lines of descent. Their family tree had become a maze where every path led back to the same ancestors. From this union came Philip III, born in 1578, carrying an elevated inbreeding coefficient that would have alarmed any modern geneticist. But the Habsburgs weren't finished. When Philip III came of age, he married Margaret of Austria, his first cousin, his sister-in-law's sister, and related to him through so many different bloodlines that calculating the exact relationship becomes a mathematical exercise in horror. They were playing genetic roulette, and with each generation, the chamber held more bullets. Their son, Philip IV, born in 1605, entered the world already showing signs of what was to come. His jaw protruded noticeably the famous Habsburg lip, a visible marker of recessive genes expressing themselves with increasing frequency. He struggled with speech, experienced recurring health problems, and showed subtle signs of cognitive decline. But he could still function as a ruler. He could still marry. And in 1649, at the age of 44, he made the decision that would seal his family's fate. He married his 15-year-old niece Mariana of Austria. Think about that for a moment. Mariana had originally been engaged to Philip's son, Prince Balthazar Charles. When the prince died suddenly in 1646, the family didn't search for a new bride from outside their bloodline. They simply reassigned her to the father. The 29-year age gap didn't matter. The incestuous nature of the union didn't matter. What mattered was keeping the blood pure, the inheritance secure, the power contained within the family circle. Mariana was Philip's niece through his sister. She was his first cousin once removed. She was related to him through at least 6 different ancestral paths, and she was terrified. Contemporary letters describe her arriving at the Spanish court pale, nervous, prone to fainting spells. She had been raised knowing she would marry within the family that was simply how Habsburg women lived, but the reality of becoming queen to her own uncle proved overwhelming. Court observers noted her frequent illnesses, her difficulty with public speaking, her tendency toward melancholy. She was a fragile vessel being asked to carry an impossible burden, providing a healthy heir to a dynasty whose bloodline had become poisonous. The couple produced several children, but most died in infancy. Their bodies simply couldn't sustain life. Philip Prospero, born in 1657, was celebrated as the future king of Spain, but his existence was agony from the beginning. He couldn't walk properly. He spoke in garbled fragments. He suffered seizures that left him unconscious for hours. Contemporary portraits show him wearing amulets and religious charms, his parents desperately hoping that faith could accomplish what their genetics had made impossible. He died at age 4, leaving the Spanish Empire without an heir. The pressure on Queen Mariana became unbearable. She was 30 years old. Her husband was in his 60s and declining rapidly. The Spanish court, the Spanish people, all of Europe watched and waited. The empire needed an heir. So in 1665, Mariana became pregnant once more. And on that suffocating November morning, as summer heat gave way to autumn chill, she went into labor. The birth was agonizing. It lasted for hours, with Mariana's screams echoing through the palace corridors while courtiers whispered prayers and physicians prepared for the worst. When the child finally emerged, the silence that followed was more terrible than any scream, because everyone in that room could see immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. Charles II's appearance at birth shocked even the physicians accustomed to Habsburg deformities. His head was grotesquely large, swollen with fluid that would never fully drain. His limbs were weak and underdeveloped, moving with uncoordinated twitches. But it was his face that truly horrified them. The Habsburg jaw had reached its most extreme expression. His lower mandible protruded so far forward that his teeth couldn't meet, leaving his mouth permanently open, drool pooling on his chin. His tongue, too large for his malformed mouth, lolled uselessly. Even his first cries sounded wrong, garbled, almost inhuman. Modern genetic analysis would later reveal the full scope of the disaster. Charles II had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, higher than if his parents had been full siblings. He was more inbred than the product of brother-sister incest. Every harmful recessive gene that had accumulated in the Habsburg bloodline over 2 centuries expressed itself in his tortured body. He suffered from mandibular prognathism, severe cognitive impairment, epilepsy, probable pituitary hormone deficiency, and a host of other genetic disorders that 17th-century medicine couldn't begin to understand. He didn't speak his first words until age 4, and even then they were unintelligible. He couldn't walk without assistance until age 8, and even then he moved with a shambling gait that barely qualified as walking. His body couldn't process solid food, his jaw deformity made chewing impossible, and his digestive system was so malformed that even liquids caused him pain. He remained skeletal throughout his life, his body unable to extract nutrition from the thin soups and broths that were the only foods he could swallow. The Spanish court faced an impossible task, maintaining the fiction that this broken child was fit to rule an empire. They commissioned portraits that minimized his deformities, though even the most flattering paintings couldn't hide the jutting jaw, the vacant eyes, the overall impression of something fundamentally wrong. They choreographed ceremonies to hide his physical limitations, propping him up with attendants disguised as ceremonial guards. They coached foreign ambassadors on how to interact with him without revealing the full extent of his condition to their home governments. But whispers spread anyway. Foreign courts heard stories about the mad king of Spain who drooled uncontrollably, who made animal sounds instead of speaking, who suffered violent seizures during state functions. Some diplomats reported that he seemed more dead than alive, stumbling through palace corridors like a ghost haunting the ruins of a once great dynasty. As Charles II grew, if his stunted development could be called growth, his suffering only intensified. He developed a paranoid conviction that he was cursed, bewitched by demons or poisoned by enemies. In a sense, he was right. He was cursed, not by witchcraft, but by the calculated choices of his ancestors. The poison wasn't in his food, but in his blood, inherited from generations of genetic disaster. At 14, they married him to Marie Louise of Orléans, a French princess who was everything he was not: young, beautiful, healthy. Her letters home to France are heartbreaking documents of despair. She described her husband as more dead than alive, unable to hold conversations or participate in even basic courtly activities. She wrote about his constant drooling, his seizures, his unintelligible speech. Most painfully, she expressed her growing certainty that he would never be able to father children. The marriage lasted 10 years without producing an heir. Marie-Louise died suddenly in 1689 at age 26, likely from the psychological stress of her impossible situation. Charles II's second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg in 1690 was even more desperate. Maria Anna later described her husband as increasingly paranoid, prone to violent outbursts, obsessed with religious rituals that might break the curse he believed afflicted him. He would stand for hours before religious relics, praying for a miracle that never came. He spent enormous sums on exorcists who performed elaborate ceremonies to drive out demons that existed only in the genetic code he'd inherited from his ancestors. The real tragedy wasn't just Charles II's personal suffering, though that was immense. It was that he was aware at least partially of what he represented. Despite his cognitive limitations, he understood that he was the last of his line, that his death would trigger a continental war, that his very existence was a source of shame and embarrassment. This knowledge added layers of psychological torment to his physical agony. As he entered his 30s, his condition deteriorated rapidly. The seizures became more frequent and severe. His speech, never clear, became completely unintelligible. His body aged decades beyond his years. By his 20s, he looked like a man in his 70s. His hair went gray and thin. His skin took on a corpse-like pallor. He could barely walk, even with assistance. He required constant supervision during meals to prevent him from choking on the thin soups that were his only sustenance. The Spanish Empire, meanwhile, crumbled around him. Without strong leadership, the government descended into corruption and incompetence. The economy collapsed. The military lost battle after battle to better organized French, Dutch, and English forces. Colonial revenues declined as governors realized they faced no consequences for their failures. The empire that had once dominated half the world was reduced to a shell, waiting for its broken king to die so the funeral could begin. European powers circled like vultures, preparing for the War of the Spanish Succession that everyone knew would follow Charles II's death. Marriage negotiations, trade agreements, military alliances all revolved around the question of when the Mad King would finally succumb to his genetic burden. On November 1st, 1700, at the age of 38, Charles II of Spain died. His final moments were as pathetic as his entire life had been. He died surrounded by physicians who couldn't help him, priests who couldn't save him, and courtiers who had spent decades maintaining the fiction of his competence. His last words were reportedly incomprehensible, a final testimony to the speech impediment that had plagued him since childhood. The autopsy revealed the full horror. His organs were described as putrefied and corrupted, though the physicians lacked the knowledge to understand they were witnessing the physical manifestation of genetic collapse. His brain was smaller than normal. His heart was shrunken. His intestines were rotted. His reproductive organs were so underdeveloped that he could never have fathered children under any circumstances. He was, in every meaningful sense, the end of the line. With Charles II's death, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty ended forever. The War of the Spanish Succession raged for 13 years, costing hundreds of thousands of lives and redrawing the map of Europe, all because a family had believed their blood was too precious to share. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of Charles II isn't the war that followed his death. It's what his existence taught other royal families watching in horror. The extreme inbreeding that had characterized European nobility for centuries began to change slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably. Other dynasties realized that genetic diversity wasn't a weakness to be avoided, but a strength to be embraced. The Habsburg disaster became a cautionary tale told in hushed tones across European courts. In the shadowed corridors of the Alcazar where our story began, silence finally fell. The screams that had echoed through those halls on that November morning in 1665 were replaced by the silence of extinction. The genetic experiment that had begun with such confidence in the 1400s had ended in absolute failure. The queen who birthed that monster had given life to the inevitable conclusion of her family's arrogance, the belief that they could improve upon nature itself through isolation and purity. The Habsburg jaw disappeared from European palaces. But the lesson remains, carved into history with the suffering of a man who never asked to be born, who never had a chance at a normal life, who existed only as proof of what happens when pride and power trump basic human wisdom. Some monsters aren't created by evil. They're created by the calculated choices of people who believed they knew better than biology itself. And the horror isn't in the monster. It's in the generations of decisions that made him inevitable.